Let's talk about not only elite tight end, but double elite tight end, and talk about what people may be doing wrong, how you can maximize your success with that strategy, and something that we've talked on RotoViz for many years about elite tight end, the benefits of it. But this year, and it's kind of like one of those things like last year, there was some of those targets. I know Sean and Ben have a Stealing Bananas that come out this week where they're talking about the running back dead zone. They talk about the evolution of that and how last year is not really an outlier. It's more the fact that there was like rookies and second year players that were in the dead zone who are now first and second round running backs. So, there was a reason why those players maybe were a little bit cheaper than, being first or second round picks based on not having done it before. But a little bit like there was an edge last year to potentially drafting those guys, the likes of a Breece Hall, for example. This year, the way ADP has set up, it gives a little bit of an advantageous setup for double elite tight end. And for people who've been listening to RotoViz Overtime over the offseason, that has been something that we've been trying to dip into. A heavy percentage of my drafts have featured two of those guys. And we are going to talk to Blair Andrews on this episode of RotoViz OT, and we are going to talk about how you can do it successfully and where maybe the window is. I know that we have a Brock Bowers, like the asterisks beside the elite tight ends. I know me and Sean are letting Bowers leak into that, even though technically it's not there. But Blair, as we get ready to talk about it, how are you and how are you feeling about double elite tight end after you've dipped into the research? Because I know there's a lot of work put into this article.
Yeah, I'm great. I'm feeling pretty good about double elite tight end this year. Of course, it depends kind of where you draw the line on who the last elite tight end is. You can make a case for a lot of guys kind of going later than we usually think about that elite tight end tier. So it
And
makes it
you've drawn the line though at George Kittle, just for people
right for
wondering where that
this.
nomination is.
Right. For the article, it made sense to stop it at George Kittle, basically getting, two tight ends in the first 6 rounds. And Kittle just happened to be the dividing line there. I think when you think about Kittle and some of the guys going after him who kind of fit that mold, you have Evan Ingram, Njoku, obviously, Brock Bowers. It does seem like there might be a difference there in terms of kind of the massive games we've seen Kittle put up in the fantasy playoffs. Even that can be just huge for advancing your team through. But certainly, I think the guys in rounds 7, 8, 9, probably up until Bowers, have some of that potential. So yeah, in terms of drawing the line at Kittle for the article, I'm excited to get into more of those types of builds and see what you can do. Of course, the balance is, or the thing to balance is, how do you take two of these guys and still make sure you're getting enough early wide receivers, especially. So that's
Yeah, and
kind of the tricky part.
we'll talk about this a little bit as we go through the article. And something that this is just after going into my head. I watched episode 1 of the Receiver show on Netflix over the last couple of days, and I've seen a lot of love based on that on social media for George Kittle, who's part of that show. But
Uh-huh.
I wonder, sometimes we get a Hard Knocks narrative as we get ready to the start of the season. I wonder will we get a bump in ADP just based on the show for that for George Kittle. But in terms of the elements of it, you mentioned there 2 through 6. So it does get a little bit easier if you're looking at, let's say, Underdog, where Brock Bowers is the tight end 10, but going in the 9th round. So if we're looking at something like that, or Njoku going in the 9th round also, that frees you up to have 2 tight ends through 9. And that a lot of the time is like, I'm trying to get somebody and Bowers, basically, is the way I'm
Yeah.
playing it. But I have drafted some teams recently. I had a team with Sean this past week where it was a Kittle team paired with Trey McBride. So there's like that element as well. But when you're looking at it, if it's through 6 rounds where Kittle is going, you really need to have your 4 wide receivers and 2 tight ends, if that is your second tight end, because Michael Dubner has, had some articles up on the site in recent times, and something that we've looked at for a long time is trying to have the amount of wide receiver firepower you need. And he talks about having at least 5 wide receivers through 7 rounds. So you kind of need, if you have Kittle by then, it pretty much means that all your other picks have to be wide receiver, and then you follow it up with a wide receiver. And the biggest part of that is obviously you pass up on all the running backs, but you're also having to pass up on that elite tier of quarterback, Allen, Hurts, Jackson, Mahomes, all those guys. And I have found myself this year very rarely having those QBs on my roster. And if it has been on my roster, it has tended to be on co-managed teams where, maybe it's after ADP. Because where those guys are going is the Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid range, and they're kind of priority guys to get on my rosters. So rather than talk about my priorities, what are you thinking of how it shapes up? Are you kind of thinking of it in the same way that you're either in the drafts that you're going with, let's say a Breece Hall, if you do that then it's very hard to make it double elite tight end, specifically when we're talking about Kittle? Maybe you can make that happen with a Bowers because you have an extra 2 rounds, but are you having to bypass those QBs? And then what has the data that you've put in the article showing over the last number of years?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think one thing that Dubner's article did really well was show, he kind of talks about how many detours you can take from the wide receiver heavy starts. And if you're taking 2 elite tight ends, you're obviously taking 2 detours right there. So you can't necessarily afford any others. So, one part of the reason that I think double elite tight end looks good, the numbers look good. Well, I should say it only looks really good if you pair it with 0 running back. And if you pair it with, it looks better if you pair it with late quarterbacks. 3 late quarterbacks especially is really good. So, there are some ways in which if you're following kind of the principles of just making sure you have enough wide receiver firepower early, making sure you try and get your QBs in the window or get them a little bit later. Don't overpay for QBs. Wait till you get to a flat part of the draft, which is something we've been preaching for, years at RotoViz. So I think all of that stuff still applies. And when you combine it with a double elite tight end, it forces you into a 0 running back, late-ish quarterback build that has historically performed really well.
It's kind of like when we look at the draft board, just pull up your ADP on the RotoViz website and look at it. It kind of, the pieces clip together for you, but they only clip together when you basically, like I'm saying, avoid those quarterbacks where you're taking Trey McBride, for example. You are passing on those, but it also means that you're passing on the dead zone, which we're doing anyway. But basically that dead zone pick is your tight end pick in most of these cases. Right. So it fits together for what you're doing. So while you are saying it only works with a 0 RB build, it only works on late quarterback or quarterbacks in the window. These are all elements of 0 RB that we've talked about for years. I guess the main change of it is talking about the second tight end and those opening rounds. It's usually get your elite tight end, get your wide receiver, get your 0 RB targets, get those quarterbacks, in the window, and then play the rest of your draft out from that perspective, build out your roster construction. But this year is kind of opening you up for the opportunity, because you're skipping potentially on the elite quarterback, but to get that second tight end. And I guess the part we should talk about also is the reason that we're looking to get that second tight end is last year we talked a lot about the profiles of the tight ends in the 10+ rounds. We had Sam Laporta, we had Trey McBride, we had players that maybe had yet to have that breakout. Even like looking through some of the names that didn't hit, there was still a lot of upside in those. So there was much more targets in the late rounds. Now I know there is some names this year that I've become more intrigued as draft season has moved along in. Jelani Woods is somebody I'm, getting that little bit of an itch for, even Joan Johnson or Mike Gesicki, but they're thinner paths, I think, to success than those guys at the top. And I think the split has really happened in terms of those first 10 rounds. There's a reason they're there. And I think then that the other part is that because there's 11 of them in the first 9 rounds, as we mentioned to Njoku, that people are thinking, well, they're easier to get. But the advantage now is you can get 2 of those guys who, one of them is a difference maker, but 2 of them then is amplifying that on your roster and giving you the edge over the other teams. It also means then that while you do probably want to still lean to a third tight end if the option is there for you with those later targets, if you miss out on those later targets, your tight end room becomes pretty much a disaster, and you end up needing at least 4 of those guys. And then that's meaning that if you're doing a 0 RB build, you're limited at the roster spot allocations. So like if you're doing quarterback in the window or trying to go late quarterback where you need maybe a third quarterback, you're able to save that additional roster spot by having those 2 elite tight ends as well, in terms of your allocated draft capital. Again, is that the way you're seeing it as well?
Yeah, definitely. I do like having kind of, irrespective of what else I'm doing, I like having a third quarterback to kind of stack some receivers with. I think there's some data indicating it gives you an advantage in the playoffs, even though maybe the advance rate out of the regular season isn't as good as 2 quarterback. But if you can build a compelling structure around 3 quarterbacks, I think that's a way to build a team that has a lot of success, especially in the playoffs. So, yeah, certainly the roster allocation is a big part of how I'm thinking about that. And like you mentioned, it depends, especially, in any season, on the actual players we're talking about. So, yeah, last year you could get Laporta and McBride and those guys in the double-digit rounds. And what's really important about them is that they had the profile of a player who could break out in such a way that they would become, a flex-worthy option for you later in the season. And that's what I think you don't get from a lot of the late names in almost every other season, including this one. There are a handful of guys that you can point to that have that upside maybe in the later rounds. I think Ben Sinnott is someone we're still drafting as an interesting guy. You mentioned a couple names that I'm not that enamored of, just because I do agree that they have the potential to give you a few spike weeks, some touchdown upside. I don't know if I see Jelani Woods being the kind of player that you can rely on,
and I think
those kind of points every week.
Yeah, and those names that I did mention, like they are into 4 tight end builds. To emphasize, but I think that you could probably Frankenstein a group together there. But the problem is if you have week 8, Jelani Woods and Gesicki hit, well, both of them might fit in your lineup that week. But then week 9, 10, there's 0 points going into your tight end spot. It could be tough, and that's again where the edge comes with the volume, but also the upside that these players have shown. And when you're looking at them, somebody heading into their second season, like a Laporta, somebody heading into their first season, like Bowers, and then somebody who's coming off their breakout season, and Trey McBride, they all are taking that step and that ascension forward. And the other part that you mentioned in the article that's interesting is, we're looking at there's more tight ends in those opening rounds. So I think more people are aware of the value of elite tight end, but they're also cheaper at the top end than they have been in previous seasons. I think that's something that gets looked over. So Sam Laporta is the tight end 1 at the end of the 3rd round. We get Kelsey. Then at the end of the 4th round, we get McBride into Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts end of the 5th round, George Kittle mid-6th. But in previous years, we've seen, the likes of Mark Andrews, the likes of Travis Kelsey really, really pushed up a couple of rounds ahead of that, which means that in previous years, you might have been passing on a Chris Olave to get a Travis Kelsey. But this year, you can take that profile and then in the next round where it starts to get into some of the running backs. And even though there is upside cases for these guys, the likes of Kyron, the likes of Derrick Henry, the likes of Travis Etienne, but then when you move into James Cook, Saquon Barkley, there's obviously some more question marks in there. And that is where you're able to get those tight ends that you want to add to the roster. So the actual opportunity cost versus previous years, I think, is making it even more appetizing, which then allows you to potentially go for that second one. It's kind of like the perfect storm is allowing this to happen this year. And I guess then when we look further into the article and the findings that you had in this, it is a case that this is a process that is it's a limited sample size that we're working from. But there still is enough of a sample size to see the ways to do it and to pair it together. And we've kind of already hit on the ways to do it, basically a 0 RB build with 2 tight ends and then going with the quarterbacks late. But is there anything else, when we're looking at this that you want to specifically highlight that people may still be overlooking? I think that point about just tight ends are cheaper, but people will see that there's more there. So it might feel like, oh, tight end's very expensive this year because the tight end 8 is in the 6th round, but it's that the tight end 1 is in basically the last pick of the 3rd round is the other change to it. They're more tightly spaced together, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's huge. And I mean, we have a pretty short memory when it comes to past ADP, but Kelsey was, even in underdog formats, he was the 106 in 2022, I want to say, or 2021, and then
Yeah.
like the 112 in 22, and then the 106 again last year, something like that. So, I mean, he's a player that not only did you have to draft him in the first round, but relatively early in the first round, like middle of the first round. You couldn't even get access to him. And so, yeah, that's a big difference when you're talking about having to spend a first round pick, having to pass on a Jamar Chase, a Justin Jefferson, a Tyreek Hill to take a tight end versus having to pass on. Now you're comparing Laporta and like Zay Flowers or something. And then, I like Flowers, but still, that's an easier decision if you think Laporta has the same kind of upside that Kelsey might have had in those last few seasons. And obviously there's, Kelsey playing with Mahomes with not a lot of target competition is a different situation than Laporta playing with Jared Goff and trying to compete with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs and maybe an ascending Jameson Williams for targets. So there are definitely some risks with some of these guys that justify the lower price compared to where Kelsey was. But still, definitely the price is a big difference. Mark Andrews was another guy who was really expensive, who, now you can get players with pretty similar kind of outlooks in terms of their upside scenarios a couple rounds later, and there are a lot of options there.
So when we get into, the win rates and the advanced rates, then moving forward, I guess I did mention that they're like limited sample sizes. You can see all this in the article as we go through it, but they are, very enthusiastic win rates and advance rates in terms of what is happening. But the sample sizes I mentioned, like we're getting into, the 800s into the 200s, kind of getting limited. But the part of it is when you limit that down to what we've talked about today with the wide receiver heavy, double elite tight end with a running back in round 7 or round 8, start to move it down, and then paired with quarterbacks in the window and so on as you have gone down through the entire process. It does still show, playoff percentage, 29% for wide receiver heavy elite tight end with a late round quarterback and a running back in the early window. When you went through it, what, I guess, do you look at when you get to sample sizes that are potentially limited, but also show extreme advance rates, like something like this here?
Sure. I think with such small sample sizes, like on the one that you just mentioned with the 29%, I think we're looking at about 100 teams that have done that. And that's over the last 3 seasons of underdog drafts. So it's, a tiny percentage of teams have even tried something like this. So what you want to see when you're dealing with those small samples are the advance rates that are like so far above the average, so far above expected, that even if there's more noise there, still you're getting something that points you in the right direction. I think the one concern with a lot of these small samples, especially when you're combining different strategies, is it's hard to account for exactly which of the strategies is giving you that boost. Like we know 0 RB is good anyway. We know late round QB probably not as good as QB window in isolation, but in the right build, it can give you a big boost. So, adding the double elite tight end to that certainly doesn't hurt you. So in a season where the prices are good on the 2 elite tight ends, it won't hurt you to take them both. And it might even give you a small boost, especially in the playoffs where we see, guys like Kittle, like Mark Andrews, Laporta last year having these really weak winning scores that you basically had to have to get into the finals. I mean, the year that you and I and Sean were in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament final, I think
Andrews.
11 out of 12 teams in the finals had Mark Andrews. So
yeah, and Mike Leone that time he had the George Kittle team, the only team with
right.
So and when you get into a small field final like that we talked that week about that potentially being a huge edge. It didn't turn out to work out that way, but like even if you look back at some of the win rates for 2023 and you look through some of the information, then even if you just break it down by specific player, like the amount of teams that advanced, you know, from semifinals to finals based on the Cleveland Browns and the Detroit Lions, you know, just the percentage of teams with a Sam Laporta, David Njoku, or maybe we don't want to mention his name, but Amari Cooper, they all had monster weeks where it helped advance teams. So there can be that little bit, you know, of luck obviously involved at that particular point, but building out the roster structure, I think is the way to try and play it. When we look though at the quarterbacks, the interesting thing throughout all of the examples that you've given in this are the 3 quarterback tends to fare better than 2 quarterbacks, and that is based on the window quarterback or the late quarterback. So when you're doing these drafts in general, is it that you're looking to get 3 quarterbacks onto most of these rosters?
I am, and that's a combination of, I think, both the potential advantage having 3 different kinds of stacks might give you in the playoff weeks, but also when you're doing such a wide receiver heavy build anyway, and you're taking the detours for tight ends instead of quarterbacks, but also especially for running backs, then you have to take more running backs. You even have to keep taking receivers in those, you know, rounds 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, where you would normally think this is the QB window. You have to use those picks at other positions. Well, you don't have to, but those are attractive running backs, especially, I think, in that range. So it can work out well, you know, if you can get the 3 late QBs paired with the high upside running backs that normally go in the QB window in these kinds of builds.
So the last question, I guess, is when you're doing your teams, which teams are you looking at most favorably post-draft this year? Is it when you have 2 tight ends? Is it when you have one of those elite tight ends? You know, and I guess the other, we're about to, spoiler alert for people listening to this as the RotoViz OT show, we're about to do a live show on the RotoViz YouTube channel after this, where we draft an Underdog best ball roster. We're going to try and put this into action. But what teams are you feeling best about once they're finished?
So I've done quite a few drafts that have ended up with both Laporta and McBride, which is a fun build. You have to
I think the last draft we did, that's what we did as well.
Oh, so. Really? Yeah, that could be. You have to take them in the 3rd and 4th round, so it does take some high leverage wide receivers out of your range pool there. But yeah, I think a lot of my teams with Bowers, even though he doesn't exactly fit the elite tight end definition that I gave here, have been really good. I think Kittle is probably one of the best values of tight ends this year. So if I can pair Kittle with a guy going earlier, I'm usually happy to do that. Depends on what receivers I had to pass up. You know, obviously there are question marks now, I think, with Addison's early availability. So, you know, taking Kittle instead of Addison, for instance, is potentially a little bit easier. But yeah, I like my teams with Kittle. I love the McBride Laporta pairing, and I love pretty much any pairing with Brock Bowers, even though that's a little bit outside the definition, but he's also one of the most undervalued players in every draft.
Yeah, so we will be doing that draft as I teased just after we record this. But if you want to head over to the YouTube channel and see it, it will also be available on the RotoViz main feed over the weekend. But I will be linking the article in today's show notes. You can check all of it out. There's much more detail, much more graphs and information about the win rates and so on up on rotoviz.com. You can check that out at your leisure. But that is going to do it for this episode. I'm joined, as I mentioned at the start, by Blair Andrews. You can find all his work up on rotoviz.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. Until we are back, have a good one.